thank you very much, Jason, for being here. Thank you so
Yes.
much, because this is first and foremost my own therapy, but it's something that I wanted to do. I wanted to do this for a long time, starting to interview or just talk, just chat with people that make sense to me.
Yeah.
This series starts with why you make sense to me, like why you matter to me. And I guess I'm saying me, but it's like people behind me as well when they're going to watch this. Um, I started knowing your work from 2020, I think, shortly, I think it's 2020 with Cyberpunk 2077.
Yeah.
The game comes out and it's like mixed by Jason LaRocca. I'm going to have a hard time saying LaRocca because people are going to go like, he's Italian. He said LaRocca, you know? And
Well, say it
so
like that. 'Cause you have the right accent,
I
so
have
you
the
can
right
say
I do. I do. Like,
it.
you know, Jason LaRocca. That's how I would say
That's
that.
right.
But it's funny that it will come to me as LaRocca because, you know, if my firmware switches to English, it's, you know, it's hard for me to go, you know, and just kind of. So, but I know people are going to go like, he can't possibly be saying LaRocca. Come on, you know, but that's legit. It's not wrong. People should stop complaining. So both
Yeah,
work. They're fine.
that's right.
They're fine. So 2020, the game comes out, but in 20, I think 18 or 19, I saw that CDPR had a call for music that they were looking for. So I sent my resume and stuff that I had done because I was back into composing more than I was engineering for labels and stuff for video games. And I got turned down. I didn't get the gig for the main scoring, but the people at CDPR were amazing in replying. Like they really listened to what I'd done. They gave me feedback on what they were looking for. And then the soundtrack comes out with your work, the scoring mixer, and I can kind of like overlap what I had done in the years up until then with what came out and kind of look at the crossroads of the missing points. I could see the differences of where I had fallen short of the vision that CDPR had. This is where you start. And from there, there's God of War, there's Joker,
Yeah.
the World is a Stage, there's Call of Duty, Black Ops, Cold War, right?
Yep.
And I
Definitely.
mean, you know, Fortnite, you know,
Right.
just to, you know, dropping titles like this. This is who Jason is to me, who you are to me. Where did you start? Like, where does Jason LaRocca start? You know, like
I'm just
how?
a music lover, you know? I mean, that's basically it. I grew when I growing up, my parents my parents were hippies and listened to their records when I was a kid. So like all the vinyl and stuff that they collected in their youth, they listened to with me on the family record player. And so I grew up with, the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Joni Mitchell and Frank Zappa and, Canned Heat and all that sort of stuff. And I there wasn't really any of it that I didn't like. Like I instantly really liked a lot of it, especially the Beatles. And we have, I have fond memories of there was this program on the radio called Breakfast with the Beatles, and it was every Sunday from like 10 a.m. till noon or something like that. And we would have brunch and listen to Breakfast with the Beatles. And it was basically just Beatles music all morning long. And um, you know, that was really kind of like where I mean, I knew right away that I loved music. And so music has always been my passion, and music has always been like I've always wanted to have a job where I can just always be doing music 24 hours a day. If I could, I would do music 24 hours a day. So anything that I can do, whether it's technical or creative in the realm of music, I feel like it's where I feel the most comfortable and the most happy. So when I was when I was in high school, I was, starting to think about jobs and how I was going to, actually make this come to a reality of actually having a job where I actually got paid doing something like this. Um, and I didn't want to find myself, being really old without any like, tangible, reality that this was actually going to happen. And so I was really kind of generally very forceful and enthusiastic about like finding something pretty much right out of the gate without going to any kind of like engineering school or music school or anything like that. And actually what happened was I found a friend of mine who was in a band that was playing locally with my band when I was a teenager, when I was in my late teens, 18. Uh, he was working for a film composer and he was leaving that job. And because we were friends and he knew that I was into engineering and had my own little home studio, he's like, maybe you want to see if you guys are a good fit and I can get you an interview. And I was like, well, I know I'm not going to get these kinds of calls very often because I didn't have formal schooling and that sort of thing. So I was like, well, absolutely, I want to meet this person. And I knew nothing about film composing or anything like that. So I knew there wasn't really a great shot of me actually landing this job. And in fact, when I interviewed for it, uh, I more or less didn't get the job. I was kind of like, he said, I don't really know that you're the right fit. It doesn't seem like, you don't know much about this world. And, I felt a little bit sad. And then I thought, well, maybe I could just be around the studio and help out and just maybe intern for a while and just, it doesn't cost him anything and just hang out for free. And I just asked him if it's cool for me to just show up every day and kind of help. And so I did that for about a week and a half, actually. He said, yeah, that sounds great. And all the while he was interviewing other people, trying to find somebody who fit the position. And then, yeah, after about a few weeks of him trying to find somebody who we thought fit the job, he's just sort of, I guess he sort of noticed the enthusiasm in me and love for what was going on and enthusiasm to learn about film composing and that sort of thing that he ended up taking me on full time. And this was Mark Isham. And at the time was doing the music for Blade, the original Blade. And so he hired me and I was basically, yeah, more or less just an intern under somebody else, really just kind of like trying to learn the ropes as fast as I could. And Blade was my kind of like dive into the deep end of the film composing world. And at the time, see, there's most people don't know about really kind of like the history of because this has been such a quick change in technologically over the last 30 years of like where things were in the film composing world on the technical side. This was when there were samplers, like there was this S760 sampler, Roland S760, which was like a really great sampler, 1 unit rack space, and it only had 32 megabytes of RAM. And to load sounds into it, you had to load them off of a hard disk um, device, and it took about 10 minutes to put all the sounds in it. Then, you had to have the MIDI connected to it. And if it was connected to another one, you had to set the through switch on the one that it was going through into, because if the power turned off and then turned back on, you had to do it all over again.
I didn't know
I mean,
that. All right.
these kinds of things most people don't know now because this technology was very fast. It was like just over the period of a few years, it was gone. But when I came in 1998, this is what the technology of film scoring was. It was like you had a DAW, there was the DAW, but the DAW didn't have anything in it. It didn't have
Hmm.
sound instruments. It didn't have contact, none of that stuff. It was like everything was external and hardware devices and stuff. So that was what I grew up on and quickly learned all the sort of quirks and things like about how all that stuff worked. And it was a little bit more cutthroat at that time too, where if you made certain mistakes, they were pretty serious. Like
Hmm.
it, having a hard drive have its correct external ID number meant the difference of the drive being wiped or not and losing a lot of data. And so like
Hmm.
things that were very unforgiving about that technology. And it was all hardware based, which was great because when you're learning something, having tangible and tactile things of like, this is how this works, and you grab the handle and you grab the knob and you see what it does, especially when you're learning and trying to figure something out, is like the best way to do it. To like in your studio, which you have a gorgeous studio, you have got hardware and you've got things that are real. And if somebody were interning for you and learning how to become an engineer or a composer, having those real things is like, I think, crucial, honestly, to getting good at something, because you have to have the real understanding of what it is in a almost a realized way, to understand how software works.
Mhm.
Once used to be hardware. All the software used to be hardware. And I think that's one thing that people don't step into anymore, is like learning first on some hardware, even if it's synthesizers, even if it's outboard gear or a console, but working first in the real worlds, because those concepts all work in the software world, but they almost give you a little bit more of a real understanding of what it is, how it
Absolutely.
works, and how unforgiving it is. Software is a lot more forgiving, but if you understand the limitations of hardware, you think a little bit more with it when you work with software. And that was in 1998, and I was pursuing a music career at the same time, so I was actually going on tour and still working in the studio, and found myself wanting to go on tour full time, which I did in 2003. I did that full time until about 2009, and then decided I just wanted to engineer full time, and I stopped touring and doing that. And so I vacillated back and forth and have had many different types of jobs in the music industry, but have found that for whatever reason, I have been really thriving in the post and job of engineering and producing, and most of the time film scores or video game scores. And and I love doing it, but it's been a long road of, like, getting to this point has been a lot of trial and error, and a lot of you know thinking my passion's never going to come to fruition, or that I've been working at this so long and it's not worth it, because it's got so many ups and downs, and good times and bad times and all this.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm still here. I mean, I have a studio, I have a commercial studio. I got this
Amazing
studio.
one as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we're-
the studio in 2017. My first gig was Fortnite, and that was in 2017 when I did Fortnite, and I had the opportunity to mix in any studio that I wanted, and I didn't have a studio at the time, but I thought maybe this is an opportunity for me to not build one, but get all of the equipment together that I need to put into an already existing nice commercial studio. And I can just give you a quick 360. There's not a
absolutely.
ton,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's this is basically a studio that was already built and is already outfitted, has great acoustics. This is great ceiling cloud,
Mhm.
and
I mean, that's the beauty of, I mean, places like LA where the commercial spaces are there. They have a heritage that you kind of, kind of accept and nurture, and then give your own history to it. And that's part of the legacy of the thing. It's as beautiful as somebody saying like, okay, I found this small barn, and it might work. Oh, it's amazing. Let's make a studio in there. I can see it work. Both ways are just what they need to be. Like, ultimately, you want to be in that space, you need to be there for tons of hours. It needs to feel good, and it's to be good technically, but it has to be good on so many levels, because as we said, the trial and error and everything else is always going to be there. So
I think that having a home studio is probably the most there's probably the it's like almost like a golden era, I feel like, for home studio options now, because
mhm.
so many people can get great things done on headphones now with all the technology of how to get room simulations in your headphones, and getting really good results with imaging that way, and mixing in, immersive formats on headphones and stuff like that too. So I think there's probably no better time than now to not necessarily be restricted by costs of having a commercial studio and still get great results. I actually, funny enough, did a lot of mixing in headphones in 2012 to 14, probably, when I was still mixing in my apartment, and I wasn't able to make a lot of noise, so I mixed on headphones for a long time, actually. And a lot of people made fun of me, and this
Mhm.
was, of course, before immersive was a real thing. And a lot of people made fun of me for mixing on headphones, and I was like, I actually mix pretty good on headphones. And I did it for a while, and then as surround started to become a little bit more of a real job for me, there wasn't at the time any other option than to be in a commercial space where you can have all of your speakers properly tuned, uh, room acoustics a certain way, and that's something you're going to feel confident in when it goes to a movie theater that is going to be sounding really, really
Mhm.
great. And that connection was very crucial. So I just decided to take the leap and get a commercial studio in 2017. And it was not in the cards for me financially, really, but I just decided to do it and see how it would work. And now I can't really leave this space because it's so much a part of my sound and what I do. But I almost envy people who don't have commercial studios at this point because you really kind of don't need it. In 2017, I had no other option to do what I do. This was the only option in, as far as I was concerned. But now I think a lot of young guys have great opportunities now to do things on headphones, which is fantastic.
When we were in Berlin up until 2023, let's say end of 22, having a commercial studio and wanting to go back to lending some time to composing as a composer was a problem. Then I found out like the space itself was kind of driving me to a specific direction with clients and stuff. And it was not just about saying, oh, I just look at my schedule, deallocate some slots for composing and compose. It wouldn't work. It would just call for whatever bubble was next there, and I would feel kind of like claustrophobically kind of close there. So I would compose at home and not in the studio, and people would be again like, "You're nuts! Why are you doing that? You have like all the gear, the control room," and I would say it wouldn't work. It won't work. I don't
Yeah,
feel like I'm doing that. So would have a tiny small keyboard, computer, everything was subpar compared to what we had. But it's exactly that. So
sure.
there's pros and cons. Obviously, you have an obligation towards what you're making as a score mixer, movies, games. I mean, it has to translate. There's a technical necessity there as well. But sometimes, especially for people who are composing and they say, I could lease a space with a friend of mine and we do that. It's a half an hour drive, with an hour of commuting and I'm like, be careful because it might not work, because when you're composing or you're writing, just be aware of it. It might be the most amazing thing or not, but it needs to be
Well,
calculated.
I think a big point of it is mindset, honestly, because
Mm-hmm.
if you get production done and you get things done in your home, then you're not going to feel you're not going to feel like there's any need to necessarily get out of your home because you're getting something done. But if you don't really like, because when I moved in here, I felt really it felt very real. Like this was like a job now, and I have to like when I step in here, I can't be on my phone and fucking around because this place is, it's an expensive place for me to rent. It's very official looking, it's intimidating. And that actually kind of pushed me to, to be better at what I do and
Mm-hmm.
to take it seriously when I'm here. So I think if you can have that mindset when you're at home, then and you get products done, that's fine. I think it's really just a matter of where you actually can get something achieved. Because like if you're at home and you've just got, some equipment and it's not that much stuff like you're saying, and you feel like maybe it's subpar technically, but that you're getting a lot done, then that's great because then that's kind of like 90% of it really is if you're actually getting something done and you're turning out product, then that's a big part of it. I didn't feel that I was when I was at home. I didn't feel like I was really able to focus enough. And for me being here, I really focus because I have nothing disturbing me. It's completely anechoic in here. I have nobody ever comes in my room. I have basically told management, they're not allowed in my room. They have to text me or call me or email me. And so I really get into a world here when I come here. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's really important. It's like artistically or technically, you have to feel like you've stepped into your pilot seat,
True. It's two beautiful sides of the same coin, and ultimately, it's a mindset thing because, as you said, this is both things might be hindering your work or empowering it. It just depends. Some people, I've had the same. Like you feel like, okay, I'm here, we work, no distractions. The other guy stays at home, produces stuff, amazing. The other guy at home might be completely distracting himself from phone or friends or people driving by or whatever. So that's important to understand. Like a balance is not the formula. It's your balance, my balance, the other people's balance. Everybody's different, but it's important to listen to a little bit of cues that kind of hint about, what could be better. Then sometimes you can't do some stuff, but it's still important to know where you would be headed. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to consider is that, you want to consider, the competition factor of what it is you do. And there's a lot of people who are going to be, trying to get your job or doing the same thing or at a similar level. And that if you've got any advantage that you can have to make your job better or to make your product better, you of course want to have those things. And so, for me, like I didn't necessarily have a lot of money to work it out, but I would sacrifice things. I didn't have as nice of a car and things like that so that I could afford this place and be able to have that advantage because I knew that was more important than, driving a nice car. And so I I think that there is always opportunity to step into another level or to improve what it is you're doing. And you always have to think about where you're going to sacrifice something to make that happen because anything you're trying to do that's worthwhile is going to have to take some sort of sacrifice because it's never easy to do. You can't
Mm-mm-mm.
go, oh, sure, how am I going to come up with this amount of money to afford this place? Okay, well, maybe just sleep on the couch and don't have an apartment and just have your studio. I'm not saying everybody should do that, but sometimes it's worth it to somebody to have that advantage or to feel that they have the advantage because it gives them a feeling of confidence that they need. So I think I did that. I knew that I've done this a lot of times. Is I've sacrificed things either monetarily by just you know e- either eating less or maybe lower
Yeah, yeah.
quality for a little while so that I could save up to buy a
We're
compressor.
giving bad advice. Bad advice. No,
I've
no,
done all these things, but they're temporary and they're
yeah.
things that are not necessarily, you're just really trying to get an upward projection going. And I think that yeah, the trajectory should always be upward and you have to sacrifice something to do it. I don't sacrifice those things now, at least not as much as I did in the past. It's like, all these things are important to me. Health, not sitting in the studio for 12 hours a day, but also, balancing it with other things. So now it's like, then you start to refine it and then you start to make it about how can you then add these other things back in, like eating properly, getting proper exercise, getting proper sleep, and being an engineer and producer. Because sometimes people have one or two of these things going, but they don't have them all in balance. And when that's the case, you eventually will hit, a dead end with something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, I don't want, to just go and quote my past as well and stuff, but you can also do it. We're not saying you should, but when you're 20, you're not 40. And when you're 40, you can't do what you used to do when you're 20, even if, you don't really know until you know that you can't do it because a moment comes a moment where you say like, okay, wait, no, I need to get out of my chair and just exercise. Even if you've never been a workout person, you just go like, my body's telling me I need to do it. When you're 20, you're starting up, you're sacrificing some stuff. It doesn't matter if you sleep on a subpar couch or bed, or if you have the occasional junk food, quick stuff because you gotta go back to the studio. But it's tough to make, like life coach with, Alberto and Jason or whoever.
Well,
But
the thing you make these points are interesting because when you're younger, making these sacrifices is actually easier.
yeah, exactly. Like,
so, so,
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's
it's
where it should
actually
happen.
true.
Like, I remember, some of the stuff I have, like, the JV and stuff, I got about 1999 or something when I started scoring music for some studios. And I remember exactly, I just had hardware, buying that piece of hardware used from somebody else took sacrifice. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to do this with my friends. They're going to go, well, I'll meet you a week after, be there. Oh, but then you're missing out on these, and these. And I'm like, I can't do it because I bought a module. And they were like, what is that? And I was like, it's not, right, because you do music. And then, I would stay up 8 hours, 10 hours working on something because I wanted the little pieces of music that I would score. I started up with bands and musicians who couldn't afford real orchestral music. to hire me to do virtual orchestra stuff. So the JV was popular, samplers were popular. You didn't have the sample libraries that you have today. Contact, Giga Studio, Giga Sampler was kind of like almost there, but it would happen probably a little bit later on. So it was hardware stuff, and buying that or staying up at night, and the next day you would hate yourself, but you would still be functional to a degree. If you do it today, it's like, I stayed up late yesterday thinking I had an advantage today. Now I'm just dragging myself the whole day. I can't do that. I gotta be smart. So you adapt. It's all about adaptation. But perspective and trajectory, and as you said, the tires are almost always about to lose traction, but you don't want to lose traction. And the more you go with your tires at 40, the tires are no longer that new. So you can't say, I know this car. It can't go this way. You can't floor it the same because it won't hold, even if the engine supposedly still is good. Or if you know the track, very well. At 40, you know it better than at 20, but tires aren't gripping as much. So, gotta
Yeah,
chat
yeah,
slower. And yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely. Absolutely. So moving on to this, because it's gonna get a little bit technical because I want to know stuff. People want to know stuff, obviously, but um, how does, before getting into technical, just very briefly, how does your, stereotypical call, which there is none for sure, every scenario is different, different movies, different games. You've got film and game going on, which are two crazier but different worlds. Sometimes games crazier than film. I don't know if you agree. Sometimes the other way around. They're all different in what they need to do, the deadlines and stuff. But how does your, say, stereotypical call work for a gig?
A stereotypical call.
Or like when like, okay, we're making this movie, we want you because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, well, so there. I mean, I don't know if there is a stereotypical call. It actually seems to be different every time. And one of the things that certainly for a long time for me, um, every time I would get a call for something, it would often be something I haven't really necessarily done musically, but because I have people who I have good relationships with, they would call me because we were getting along and we're friends and we were sort of building a momentum of just working together. And I like an example would be like Paddington, for instance. When I did that, I had never been to London. I had never worked at Air, and so that project was very new in that way. And but I had worked with the composer a number of times. This was Nick Urata who did the music for the first Paddington, and we were really getting along. We were doing a couple of projects together, and I had worked also with his band Debotchka. And um so that was really just kind of like almost the conversation wasn't really just out of nowhere. We were already kind of building a momentum of conversations that led to Paddington and going to London. And so I think a lot of times that's actually where the conversations are, is they're in sort of the momentum of starting something, and it's usually something small, like maybe it's a demo or a small TV show or something like that. And because we got along really well and we're doing, you know, sort of getting to, we're friends basically, starting point being that we're friends. And then it's like, oh, well, this is the next thing I have. Like, working with Bear McCreary was like, we were doing a couple of TV shows and we're doing a couple of smaller projects. And then he got God of War and he called me for God of War. And so it wasn't an out of the blue phone call. It was like we were already talking constantly every day, and it kind of turned into that. So I think that's the biggest thing. And really for me, it's like where a lot of most of my cool gigs have come from some sort of momentum where I started out doing something simple and small with a client, and then it turned into being in the right place at the right time for a bigger project. And like God of War was like that. Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power was like that. And again, like every one of these projects has always been something about it has been a new thing that I have never experienced. So I feel like there's always some degree of like um, maybe I don't necessarily. I know that I'm the right person for the job on a lot of anything I do because I always make myself right. But there's a nervousness of like, oh, this is going to be a new experience to some degree, and is this going to come out right? So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's always that, and I think that's, but everybody feels that to some degree because everything to some degree is a new experience, especially in the music world. I mean, unless you're just, I don't know, sitting at the computer and just writing the same, you're just writing piano pieces every day. Maybe it starts to feel like it's the same thing. But what I do is never the same thing, like ever. Mixing for Cyberpunk versus God of War versus Assassin's Creed were all very different projects, very different approaches, and very different relationships with the clients too. So I think it's like, for me, I'm always just trying to stay really busy. So like I like to just, like I said, I would love to immerse myself in music as long as I can and throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout the month. So I'm just always talking to people and always kind of yeah, just immersing myself in conversation and that sort of thing, which just sort of leads me into projects and doing things with people. It's just kind of how it often works for me is like I think the sound of it and the technical side of it uh a lot oftentimes becomes almost like the second conversation. And the first conversation is just that, well, we're just doing it together because we're having fun together and working together and enjoying
Mhm.
you know, our friendship. And so a lot of it is that, like the technical side, obviously like with I don't know, with God of War, for instance, it was like that happened during the pandemic, a lot of that. And that was a big change of like how to approach mixing this stuff where none of us are in touch with each other physically. Uh, so everything became, very reliant on, the file shares and all that stuff, which of course now is very commonplace, but
Mhm.
uh, everything was completely internet based as far as sharing stuff. And then we were recording choirs and orchestras where everybody had to be 6 feet apart. And so the orchestras were, we had way more microphones because, everybody's so far away, everyone's getting their own microphone on them and things like that. And we're like, how the hell do we mix and pan this stuff?
Mhm.
Because this is not how we're used to, we're not used to getting a recording back from somebody with, 100 microphones. It's like, what do we do with these things? So, you just put your best foot forward in this and hope that you're going to do the right thing. And with what experience you do have, if you've, you know, got yourself pretty close to, uh, you know, something like this in the past, you're going to have enough knowledge from what you've done previously that you're not going to fall on your face. So, to me, it's like keeping the constant experience going, keeping the wheels always turning is kind of like important because like you don't for me, like if I take a month off or if I take four, it's like I lose I feel like I lose skill quickly in the stopping of things. So if
Mhm.
I'm always going and I'm constantly working, I feel like that mind momentum for me is what always keeps me able to think quickly on my toes, even if it's something I don't know technically right away. I figure it out because I'm always kind of like, I've always got my mind constantly going, basically. I don't like to
Mhm.
stop.
Awesome. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense. You've named some of your work and going into a little bit more of a technical thing. In fact, if I have someone in front of me who hasn't listened to any of the works you've done, and I had to kind of like tell them why they should listen to them from a musician, composer, engineer, whatever standpoint. I don't want to name them all, but for example, cyberpunk would be how aggressive the thing is, how much distortion and forwardness and aggressiveness there is, but still in a dynamic fashion, how the music translates to this level of, I think the saturation and distortion and harmonic content and things that are clashing together but still have space. That's the number one thing that I love from that soundtrack, from the
Mhm.
mixing. If I had to say, for example, Valhalla, That's more of how the instruments that has a lot of the northern, obviously Scandinavian
Yeah.
and also Scottish, Irish kind of vibe. All the real instruments and how they breathe around. There's a lot of nice air in between the instruments that you don't have in Cyberpunk because of the sound palette and how it is. God of
Yeah.
War Ragnarok is the dynamic range of that thing, which I don't know how you all achieve because I've got tons of game soundtracks. God of War Ragnarok to this day can throw you off the chair. Like it's not the lowest part are not too quiet. Like you don't need a cinema system to just enjoy the dynamics. You can have, earbuds or proper monitoring. But when the percussion, the low stuff, or the heavy low and fast transients kind of hit you, it feels like your system's different from whatever other soundtrack you've listened to. So that is to me the
Yeah.
number one quality of that thing. I could go on, and
Yeah.
then there's Romulus, which I haven't said, like Alien
Yeah.
Romulus,
Yeah.
which is like how the real versus the fake sounds, saying like more of the orchestral parts, the organic acoustic stuff versus the electronic. There's an organic level of artificial life in the instruments, which really translates well. Benjamin's done like an amazing work with that contrast, and the mix and what you have done has just that contrast leaves organically once the sounds, the artificial stuff comes forward. It's scary, but it's enticing. You want to hear that change of soundstage, which is not really a change, is that you establish a distance through
Yeah.
which the orchestral stuff, like a comfort zone of saying, okay, well, it's tense, but okay, I know where I am. And then the synthetic, artificial kind of live sounds and things get closer to you to a level that you didn't think possible. And that
Sure.
contrast between forward and back is just unbelievable. That is,
Well,
that,
I mean, if I were to just sort of name plugins that I would sort of identify with the sounds of each of these of
like
each of these.
are we listening to digital these
Yeah.
tracks? Are we listening
Oh, yeah.
to a digital session or a hybrid or out of the
Mostly.
box?
Well, each one is separate. With Cyberpunk, it's very digital. Uh, Although there's analog synth sounds in that, but the score, the stuff that I mixed, which was Paul Leonard Morgan's stuff, he had really aggressively treated this stuff on the composing side, and did it with a lot of different plugins and chains of distortion plugins, and especially in the drums. And he recorded live drums, which I think is another big part of the impact of that score, because there are digital drums and then there's live drums on top. So you definitely get the sense of initial hit and then this sense of space, which, primarily in a digital sounding score, having that little bit of space, especially in the impact of drums, makes it hit a little bit harder. And there was definitely treatment and stuff like that that I did on that, but a lot of it was already pretty heavily treated. Sound Toys probably was a big part of it, and then SSL, like Plugin Alliance SSL 9000J probably was another plugin I used quite a bit on the mixing of that. It was like Double Lock, Decapitator, and SSL, which are three pretty aggressive
Exactly.
plugins.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And but at the same time, not it's just full on obliterating distortion plugins either, but they're aggressive ones because the sounds were already pretty aggressive, and sometimes it was a matter of just making them sound aggressive from a mix perspective, kind of like an Andy Wallace kind of approach or something like that.
Mhm.
And then with Valhalla, that was really organic. A lot of that stuff is either recorded or, like Sarah, I did Sarah Schachner stuff. There was a lot of recorded stuff but then manipulated by her later. She's got a lot of cool analog synths, and then Yes for Kids, same thing. He's got
Mhm.
a lot of vintage synths and things like that. So there was a lot of hybrid in that score, but obviously leaning forward with quite a bit of acoustic element. And none of that stuff was, all of it had I guess it was really just kind of trying to treat it all with a bit of sense of, I don't know, wonder and floating. I
Yeah.
would almost just this wonder and floating. It was like a sort of a floating sound, which I think we achieved pretty well. And sometimes they wanted to get pretty aggressive, but generally it was like just giving something really wide sound and separation between things. And I would probably say primarily plugin wise, probably just a lot of digital EQ. I love this EQ called Equality, which is a DMG plugin. They make the Limitless plugin. Their EQ is great, and I love it, and I
That's
use it a
Dave
lot.
Gamble, yeah, but he's a
Yeah,
mastermind of code and stuff. Yeah, these are
yeah,
really good. I know Equilibrium as well is another great one
yeah,
that they do like
exactly.
every.
So cleaning things out with that plugin a lot, just to kind of really like carve space out for things is kind of probably where I would sort of think of that plugin first as like one of the main plugins I used on that score. And then God of War was like, I mean, that was such a largely orchestral score. There was almost, I mean, I don't even think there was barely any synths in that at all. That was
Mm,
all purely
I don't.
recorded.
Yeah, I don't think so. Or
But
as usual,
if there
like
were, there was very
they're
little.
supported
Very,
exactly. They're not main picture. Yeah.
yeah. And vocals obviously is a big part of that score, and chanting and choirs and bass vocals, bass male vocals, and that is just a big sound. And um there was I used a lot of Pultec EQ and also what's the sound theory Gullfoss plugin,
Mm-hmm.
just to kind of bring out the texture of the acoustic instruments. And I think the Gullfoss is really good for that. Abbey Road Saturator is another really good one for pulling out the texture of acoustic instruments, like the hurdy-gurdy and things like that, where you start to hear all the little tiny,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just pulling on the strings and things like that. So um, that was a big part because you did a lot of solo instruments, but they had to sound really big. So even though they were small, tiny instruments that make very little sound, we had to sort of explode them into, you know, being up front and being really close and in
Mm-hmm.
your face. Yes, it's a dynamic score for sure, but that score got loud when it got loud, and that was a
Yeah.
lot of
Why do
a
you
lot
have more
of
beats than we do? How do you do that? It's like, what? Wait,
it's,
he's got more beats.
you
This
have to
is
mix in 30 bit. Uh for sure. But it's like we're also mixing in multi-channel on God of War. That was quad. And so when you're mixing in more than stereo, you tend to have a little bit more dynamic range. And so when it gets down to stereo, those scores sometimes feel a little bit richer,
yeah,
because they're
but I think
multi-channel.
it's how you mix it, I mean, the contrast, the transients and stuff. Yeah, there's no denying. Unfortunately, that's not the beats. I can't buy the beats and it won't work.
Thank you.
Yeah,
There was actually, funny enough, reverb wise, a lot of it's Valhalla.
I was gonna
Yeah,
ask because the
a
reverb
lot of
one,
Valhalla shimmer, a lot of shimmer. Yeah, on
I
that
love that
score.
plugin. Absolutely. Like still
Yeah.
undefeated to its degree because it's kind of old.
So
It's not that new,
yeah,
right? I mean, we're talking Decapitator as well. I mean, there's oldies, but I was going to ask you about the reverbs, like the venues, the concert stages that these things have been recorded in are like, legendary. But
yes, yes.
is there
Yeah,
hardware
exactly.
reverbs or
Actually, that's a good point that you said that, because actually a lot of the recordings from Air were not treated very much in terms of reverb. A lot of that score was like very minimal reverb on the orchestra itself. It was pretty much the room.
yeah,
From
beautiful.
what I recall. Yeah. So it was obviously starting with a really great recording where the Air, reverb already was providing so much richness that we almost didn't want to get in the way of that. So like the brass and the strings had very little reverb on them, a little bit of symphony 3D, just to kind of help with it.
I love that.
It's it's a great reverb. My favorite orchestral reverb. And a lot of the solo instruments are shimmer, like Valhalla shimmer, or I don't think we had the Valhalla Supermassive at that time, but Shimmer was like the one we used for a lot of the cool spacey things, or even the vintage Verb. But that was pretty much it. Those two reverbs was kind of, and the drums I used a lot of Altiverb because they were actually recorded in small spaces. Because of the pandemic, we weren't able to record them on score.
Mm,
So a lot of the drums were self-recorded at homes, and I had to make them sound like they were recorded at Air, so I would use Altiverb for that. Those were the three reverbs pretty much that achieved the sound of that score. And Romulus was again, well, a lot of the stuff that I mixed for that score was the really heavily treated synthesizer stuff that was hybrid. So it had a very primarily leaning forward with synthesizers, but then had big orchestral elements to them. And I treated the orchestra with a lot of different things that were not typical, like, delays, and some distortions, a lot of double lock on spot mics and things like that to get things
mm.
a lot more like as if you're recording a solo instrument rather than thinking of it as like, okay, we're just using tree mics. And the actually Beef was like the probably the main plugin I think I used on everything.
Okay.
Callum Audio, I think, is the company
Mhm.
that.
And I think the contrast, like spot mics, having that separation, like what you're getting presented with as a mixing engineer, the way orchestral sounds are recorded, whether it's a deca or spot and stuff, and then you pick some of them, and then you, let's say, you don't over process them, but you kind of get the attitude in a specific spot, the way it contrasts with the rest of the ambience, or you sometimes process the ambience mics and you keep the direct natural. It just creates
Yeah,
that, game. It's a taste thing. Unfortunately and luckily, it's not like, you do this, you get Romulus. And then there's the chain of everything, the
yeah,
people.
that score progresses from something very organic into something very mutated.
That's a
And
story thing that it has a lot, right? I
yeah,
think it's one of
yeah,
the records, the soundtracks that really have a curvature, like a story effect. You're playing a solo in jazz, you want that curve, you want the story. You're playing a
yeah,
song, you want that story, verse, chorus, whatever. That soundtrack, and I got the soundtrack long after I watched the movie. I had watched the movie, and I was like, it's got the story in the soundtrack, And funny you
yeah,
say like, well, every soundtrack's got. Well, that not as much, not as much. That one really has an evolution of thing that goes towards the, I won't spoil it, of course, because there's people we don't want to ruin them, but it's a story more than other soundtracks that are more static or functional to the thing. That one really works. I paused the first time. I was like, I can feel the development of things, not just the episodes of what happens, but
yeah,
the sound just builds itself into, organ. And yeah, as you say, yeah, I don't want to spoil it because I'm that close to
yeah,
do
yeah.
it.
It starts to really take off and kind of get out of
Absolutely.
hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get And so the unhinged stuff was really just Callum Audio is like Beef. It was like automating it a lot with uh automating the distortion of it with what there was something I was doing actually with that. Oh, so it was that and also sound particles. I was using a lot of sound particles, the panner and the energy panner was a big thing actually because we were mixing that in too. So we were making some of the synthesizer sounds be very immersive and just
Mhm.
ping kind of like everywhere. And so when things would start to really get out of hand and crazy and chaotic, I was really trying to jump things off the screen. And it was kind of Ben Walfish had mentioned, he said, this should sound incredibly immersive and a bit unhinged. And so that was, the sound particles stuff was really good. Brightness panner and the energy panner were a big part of that. And then the beef just to, take things a little bit too extreme, you know. Oh, and also like K clip, like really clipping things hard, but then like getting this like as much volume out of things as we could and it was, yeah, it was like really sort of extreme processing with almost exclusively those kinds of plugins, K-Clip, and Beef, and the sound particles stuff.
And I haven't named many of the other works of ours. Like Black Mirror, what you've done is Mark Isham, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, back again with somebody who had worked years ago, like how it started, sort of how it's going, the thing, you know. Yeah. That one's more about like a little bit more intimate, a little bit more broken, fragile. The pianos are more
Yeah,
like floaty.
he wrote a really cool score for the one that he did was,
Archangel, I think it was.
yeah, exactly. And there was a lot of solo cello in that, which
Mm,
was Vanessa Freebaron Smith, and she was doing stuff that was like, it was, beautiful, but then she was also getting a lot of almost like guitar feedback sounds with like very heavily sopant driven bow, like, against the bridge and stuff like that. And then we sort of took those things and distorted them a little bit, but the sort of like a very aching score,
mm-mm.
which I was already a fan of the show. And so, when I got to work on it, I was like, oh, yes.
I have listened to more of the music that I've actually watched. I wasn't aware that it got to so as many seasons as it is. I thought it had stopped. I don't know why, because I live, too much in here. As you manage, like you get cut off the world. And I was like, what? Are there like whatever 6 seasons? Or I think I watched two of them, and I was like, it's the most thing. Why haven't they made more? And they were like, what do you mean? Like they like what? It's like there's more than two. I was like, is there more than two? I was like, yeah. So I got the
Being a
music way
modern
before
solid.
watch.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
I know.
And it's
It's really good. The music's really good too. Yeah, like you
yeah,
said,
yeah,
it's a great show, and it is like, I think can probably just go on forever. Like Twilight Zone did. It's like, just, you could just kind of just keep making dystopian stories for as long as you can think of dystopian stories.
yeah,
So
absolutely,
you can
yes.
you
So
can go forward in time, you can go backward in time, whatever you want.
mm-mm. No, no, I'm a fan. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't played these specific games. I'm still gaming a little bit. I used to game more the old days, but I mean, who doesn't know these titles in the gaming field? I mean, everything we've mentioned, even Cold War that we have, I haven't quoted, but it's like the choir, the voices, the low stuff. It's got like it's drenched in the atmosphere of that specific chapter so well, and it's got the low that one. I think what I like the most is sometimes we talk about these with students and people follow me, the cold reverb stuff, not the Valhalla ones where it's like things are floating. Cold War, the Call of Duty that you did has got that sort of like tank, sometimes cold metallic reverb, and it blends so well when you bring in lower choir or instruments that would like to be real, but your brain probably processed that and goes like, why should this instrument be in here? And that's exactly
Yeah.
the
We weren't
contrast.
going for super glossy with that. So it wasn't, yeah, like you said, it wasn't like big, lush reverbs. There was well, sometimes it would, but it was like Jack's very particular about sounds. He's an engineer himself, so he would be pretty discerning about how much of something to use. And I think at the end of the day, that score is, yeah, it's fairly aggressive without a ton of ambience, even though, there obviously is orchestra and there's choir. The only thing that was, particularly challenging on that one was that, again, this was during the pandemic, where no one was allowed to record choir together, so everybody had to record the choir individually at home, and that was, more or less a bit of a nightmare. And I think to make that sound like a
Mhm.
choir recorded at air or something like that took a lot of work, where we had to really get into fine panning and putting it then into a room that felt like it was real. And we had to really we had to really mess with that one quite a bit, actually, to get it to work. And I think it was a combination of quite a few reverbs to make those spaces sound convincing. And that was just another one of those things where, you listen to the score now, and you don't necessarily know the challenges we were facing, because it just sort of sounds like that was just a bunch of people that recorded in a studio and great, but it wasn't. It was like 32 people with 32 microphones, the deadest closet sound you've ever heard if you solo them up without any reverb. And it's like, well, how do we make this sound like, you know, big and, robust? And so yeah, it was like combination of, I think, probably, Valhalla Room and Altiverb, and also I used what was it called? Ocean Way reverb,
Hmm.
the room. So a little bit of that too, just to get it to sound like it was actually in a space, and then, a little bit of reverb too. But a lot of that was, from what I remember anyway, the
Yeah,
biggest
yeah.
challenge was choir to sound like it was a choir.
So we're like in your mixing situation, we're not looking at tons of hardware in the mixing room. I mean, you do some there's no rule. I mean, you're probably, doing what you feel you have to do. But in general, this is more of an in the box thing where you mix and it, you know, gets you going more, I think. Like this is
Well, I think a lot. Well, I don't know if people think about this necessarily until they actually come face to face with the problem. But when we're mixing something like a lot of the scores you mentioned, they're all pretty high track count scores, and they're usually somewhere between 200 tracks to, sometimes in the extreme, they're 1,000 tracks or more. But that's also because just a recorded orchestra is usually about 50 channels of microphones. And when you record them doing short strings, you've got 50 channels. And then you record them doing long strings, you've got another 50 channels. And then you record somebody doing a flute solo, you've got another maybe 20 channels. So just these recorded passes of orchestra add up very quickly. And you can't usually put much hardware on these things because you just don't have the feasibility of having that many pieces of hardware. So you have to really kind of pick and choose where you're going to use hardware and what you're going to use it for. And I think the more things become immersive, and the output channel count is becoming 7.1 or 7.12 or something like that, to have, 9 channels of manly massive passive is only going to serve one output of something. In other words, I have to record and send all of this material in separated stems and buses. I can't just give somebody a full mix and say this is it. Certainly not in video games and TV and film. I have to give them the short strings in 7.1. I have to give them the long strings in 7.1. I have to give them the brass, the woodwinds, the drums, all these things have to be their own 7.1 delivery. And so you start to think with the math of all this, and the hardware just starts to become more and more impossible in terms of how to implement it in something of that scope. It's one thing to have a really cool piece of hardware on your stereo bus and call it a day, but we have to really dissect this stuff and keep it pretty modular all the way up until the very end of the process, because it has to get edited, changed, and manipulated, and we can't be restricted to everything being tied together in just one stereo file or one 7.1 file. We have to be able to have all this control. So hardware just kind of pushes itself more and more out of the picture. I used hardware for a while to do like certain solo instruments. Like I would maybe put a very mu on the piano, or I would put like an Avalon EQ on something, or um, maybe just use some outboard compressors and EQs and some reverbs. But then started to find myself working on more and more like multiple projects at the same time, where we weren't just working on one thing for a week. We were working on two or three different clients throughout the week, and having to recall these different things. And if I had a piece of hardware tied across multiple projects, it became more and more likely that I would fuck something up. If somebody was to call me at 2 a.m. and I just was not very well slept, and I would recall the wrong preset and then send them a mix update, but it had the wrong reverb recalled. Anyway, you get the point.
yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
So hardware has kind of worked its way out of immersive mixing for me, and because of just the practicality of it. And I don't feel that it suffers sonically. I think that the stuff that I gravitate towards now uh, is not even emulations of hardware. It's just, plugins that are only plugins and are not, emulating something that existed in hardware form. So I feel very comfortable in that space. I don't feel like I'm trying to emulate a Chris Lord algae, mix space or something like that. I feel very much like that the tools I have in the box are the tools I want and need for what I'm doing.
Mhm.
And I don't feel like I'm yearning for. Although what's funny and ironic about it is the whole reason I got into engineering was because the guy who I learned from, Steve Krause, had so much great hardware. He had everything Brent Averill ever made, which was the guy who was before BAE Audio was Brent Averill, and he made all these great hardware racked versions of, well, not even versions of, he would take modules out of old consoles and rack mount them. So he had all these great CalRec preamp EQs, Neve 2254 compressors and 1073s and API racks and all the stuff. And I was like, I have to own all of this stuff. This is the coolest gear
Mhm.
ever. And now, of course, now it's like
Times
I'm
shifting. Yeah.
what I'm saying out of my mouth almost, disappoints me, because the reason I got into this stuff was like your racks behind you. I'm like salivating because I'm like, that's the reason I
Yeah.
got it.
But
It's
then in the
so
end,
fun,
again, yeah, I know. But then in the end,
you know?
times
But
change and there's
when you get into a profession and when you get into something, this is sometimes the difference you start to see when somebody starts to think of something professionally and when someone thinks of something as a hobby. There's a different mindset because you're thinking professionally, you're thinking, how am I going to get this job done really well, efficiently, on time, and not lose money? You know what I mean? And there's a lot of factors, and you're never sacrificing quality by saying, "Oh, a plugin is beating it out." You're simply just being practical. It's like, I know how to get the same sound. I've used hardware. So I have the imprint of what hardware does and can do for me musically, but I'm going to get it a different way. I'm going to get it a way that's going to fit my workflow and my work needs, and not feel stressed about the tube breaking in the middle of the mix and having to call out for someone to fix it and having to take a 5-day break. I learned all these lessons because I've experienced all these terrible scenarios of deadlines not matching the nice esoteric world of having a cool
yeah.
piece of hardware. This is just me and my experience. But there's a lot of guys who are doing it. I mean, it's like even Andrew Phelps. It's like, do you see any hardware in this guy's mixes anymore? Not a lot.
Mhm.
There's a lot of guys who maybe one day were really into hardware and you see them using less and less and less of it. And it isn't necessarily because of just getting old and being bored. It's like they've found ways to make it make sense for them and also manage stress and other things too at the same time.
Absolutely. Like, I don't want to make it about myself, but I know that when I say I can talk about lots of composers. The gear I have here that you see, if I were to use it mixing wise, dialing in things each time for a specific track or sketch, 30-second thing that I'm sending to somebody, that would be impossible. So the way that it's used, it's giving synths and other stuff that I have sound on its way in when it gets tracked into the DAW, but there's settings and there's combinations that I like that are not set in stone, but they're there. And so that I can dial things in and capture some more vibe, print it into audio, get things going so that the session can recall fast because the recalls are, there's lots of, if sketch 21 that I make out of a kid's video game piece of music makes it, they want 21 A, B, C, D, E because they want to try different things. I don't have time to recall things. Should these things be on specific tracks on, how it would be years ago? It's too much. So there's a structure, there's a method to the madness, but it's still fast. It's, I use it, but it just gets imprinted in the sound palette of the things I do. And then I'm in the box and I, like you, use a ton of plugins that don't have equivalent in the analog world, and they sound perfectly fine. I mean, and they, ultimately, what sound are you after? We're after that sound palette. Okay, well, we get there. It doesn't need to be the UI. I mean, some of them are amazing and they emulate old stuff, but then again, having used hardware helps a ton. I agree with you on that one. Like, I think that purely digital is really hard, really hard. Like, to some degree, I often say analog is easy. It's expensive or whatever, but if you grow into a system where somebody teaches you how to use these things. When I was interning or doing composing for other engineers, they had this Neve console, another one had an AMEC console. I would just be there not knowing anything about it, but the physicality of how these guys would move, mute the fade or drop the faders down or mute them when tracks were not playing because the noise would build up and things, it would stick with me. And I would go home and only had plugins on Digital Performer at the time I was using, but I was kind of thinking that way without even knowing. And I realized today that's what's missing. It's very hard to translate that on people that are 100% digital mentalities. And I often say, look, it's harder your way, so don't blame yourself. But, I can help. And you can get help from the old ways, even if you don't use a pull tech the way it was meant to be used, whatever,
Sure.
cutting vinyl
Yeah.
or whatever. So it makes perfect
I think
sense.
you have to have some background in hardware, even if it's for, a year, and I think any time that you get in on analog knowledge, it will always serve to help you in some way in the digital world, and it will give you a tactile understanding of signal flow, what EQs are good for creatively and technically. And I think the best way to learn those things the fastest is to use some sort of hardware. It's just the greatest way to get the trial and error of what it is you feel makes you excited about something creatively. And I definitely do use hardware. In fact, I use this reverb,
Ooh,
which I like a lot. And I do use sometimes the modular where I put things through it just to get filters and stuff like that. But like you, I will just record something through it and print the reverb. I don't leave the reverb on. I just make it a sound with it, and then I then add it to the dry sound, or I'll do the same thing with the modular for the filter. So it's almost not really musing it for mixing. I'm just kind of getting something texturally to add into it. And if the client doesn't like it, I just mute it. So I think anything I ever use analog, I never rely on it to be just sitting there on and always working. I just print it. And if it works, then great. And if it doesn't, we mute it. And I just only use it if I feel like, oh, this is what my mind is thinking. I'm thinking of that sound or whatever. Same thing with, like, I see you've got like a culture vulture down there
yeah.
or something. Yeah.
What is it?
A
Yeah.
great,
It's
a great
blinking there.
analog. Yeah,
Yeah.
a great analog device for doing things creatively. And again, not something I would ever leave on in a mix. I would I would turn it on, get a culture vulture sound, print it, and then I would add it in. And if it was working in the mix and survived, then fantastic. And if it didn't, we don't have to feel bad that we turned off something that was analog. We don't have to feel like the mix is suffering because there's nothing analog on it. It's digital counterparts or versions of these things are just as good and then sometimes better. So I don't think there's even a discussion about that anymore. It's really just a matter of what gets you to the end result the fastest.
Mm-mm-mm. And I think one element we're leaving out that I want to quote for people that are watching this is the faders. Do you agree with me? Like, digital control surface, okay, but the faders, because the movements, this is a lesson I've learned on myself on what I had to improve. And this is very recent, how much I realized the obvious that tiny little movements in the tracks rather than, I don't know if you use, I mean, again, there's no rule, but rather than compressing everything to perfection, then you get an overdub or you get another take that they did and you got to replace that and your compression no longer works. So riding the faders a tiny little bit on little things here and there is an
Of course.
instrument on its own, and that's hardware. And we look at compressors in the racks and go like, oh, that's hardware. There's those faders. I don't know if you what you use, but I'm pretty confident you'll have some kind of control surface to just move stuff around.
I I use the Surface for doing uh, a lot of balancing to get me started, and then I do a lot of clip gain to do a lot of the subtle things that I want to do because I feel like I get I get to the end result faster by drawing in clip gain. So that's just me personally, but I definitely think that having things always have subtle movement to them does make the difference of something that feels flat and something that doesn't. But there's some people that really don't like I've learned also that it's client based because I don't think that everybody likes that. Not everybody likes a lot of subtle movement. They like things to feel more about tone than about
Mhm.
um breathing necessarily. And then there's some that really do want a lot of that where they're like really go extreme, make string uh uh, ups and downs, make them feel even higher up and even lower down, and like really accentuate and go for the real romanticism of it. Um, I think I change my style based on that because I don't I know that not everybody actually likes the same thing.
Mhm.
So I think it's like that's a really good point. I think it's a really good way to think, but I think again, it's a not necessarily 100% rule that writing faders is always the key to the mix because sometimes the key to the mix is actually more just about the tone you're thinking about
The
more than
body.
it is about the thing feeling like it's breathing. So I've used I would always just sort of start a mix like the same way where I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna give it fader rides. I'm gonna put Neve plugins on it to make it sound analog. And then again, and one of these things through experience, I realized that not everybody cares about the same thing, you know? And I think that's the interesting thing about art and how it marries with technical things because not necessarily the same technical approach works for everybody's ear. And so I start out really just doing what I think my ear wants it to do. And then I learn what the client wants creatively because they're usually going to want something different that I'm never thinking of. And it's interesting to learn the way people hear music. Everybody hears it very differently. It's very interesting,
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely. That's incredibly interesting. Yeah.
But some people
Cool, cool,
really
cool.
think about the the subtleties of piano notes, and that's all they care about.
Yeah.
They just,
And how
they
felt
care
that
about,
is. Many genres are like, if you get the piano right, do whatever you want with the
yeah,
rest. It doesn't matter. It's like, no.
piano velocities sometimes is like all I've had some clients that all they care about is piano velocities. And it's like the 80% of the time that's what they're asking me to do is change piano velocities. And then there's guys who I've had really care about the reverbs and how long they are and how much of it to have. And some guys, that's all they want to talk about is the reverb. And so I'm never trying to chase something like technically, I'm always just trying to feel like what is it that I initially think the thing should be? And then I try and have a conversation because I think having a conversation with somebody is really important about a mix. It's one of the things that makes this job a little strange is that a lot of the time these days we're just alone, and I'm alone. And I think that that's good, maybe 50% of the mix, but I feel like the other 50 usually should be a conversation, you know?
Absolutely. That's a very, very
Yeah.
important point on top of all we said and curious because, yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of constructive things that one can take. I, for sure, like, absorbing from you these experiences and saying, like, look, yeah, but I've done this, but not all the time. Maybe I'm in this phase where what I've done has gotten to
Yeah.
clients that were more like, why don't you make it float more? I got revisions this way. Next people will be the opposite. That communicating is really important because we think we do. I think it's two ways as usual, obviously. Clients come or people that do commissions and say, like, I want this. and they haven't really explained it that much. That's no problem, but we gotta keep the channels open. So I do stuff, I send it back to you, we talk, we do it. It's very important. You can only get to a certain point by
It's a
yourself
really,
after a while.
really good point. And I think that's why people get disappointed in or maybe they get really, really hurt when a client turns something down, is because maybe they got a little bit too invested in it before they started talking with the client about it.
Mm.
And that's one thing I've learned is I go, I'm going to make this sound good because I obviously don't want to send them something I don't like. Because then when they start saying they don't like it, I'm like, well, I didn't really like it either. So I don't know why I sent it to
Exactly.
you. I get it to a point where I really like it first, but then I want to have a conversation about it. And I think that's the point that certain people maybe when they're starting out or feel insecure about, they don't do fast enough. It's like it's okay to have a conversation about what it is you're doing. You don't have to feel uh, uh, threatened or anything like that because you're not. It is a conversation. It is going to be a subjective view as to whether or not something is or shouldn't be. It's like, don't think, oh, I have to make this thing perfect before anybody hears it, because it is a subjective conversation. It is not necessarily ever going to be perfect because it's for somebody. It's not for you. And what that person thinks and has to say should get in, they should get involved sooner than later so that you also don't feel burnt out on what it is you're doing and feel like you have the room and capacity to improve it and change it, and certainly not feel bad about having to do so.
Absolutely. Last question, then we close, because this was a gold mine. I knew that. As I said, I'm doing this for myself on behalf of other people that I think, but this is primarily, as you said, like it's gotta sound good for me. This is pretty much the same thing. Like I knew that this much information is like a gold mine of information was gonna happen. So is there a dream gig at your point in your career that you would like what would you dream, what would Jason dream of doing after Ragnarok? I mean, more of that, of course. Like I want to keep working on this. It's a genre I love. I love working with these people. These we know. But if there was something that you know that you feel you
I
haven't,
have I have a dream gig actually that I am going to be doing soon, but I haven't actually talked about it because I can't talk about it yet.
okay, that's perfect.
But one that I haven't worked on yet that I would really like to is Star Wars, of course, because
Okay,
who doesn't want to work on a Star Wars project?
yeah, but yeah, legit. Okay, well, we'll see that.
So
Absolutely.
hopefully one day.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, Jason, thank you very much for doing this. This was amazing. And again, I knew that, I'm just so glad that we made it happen. So much to learn from, so much things that are, angles, so much that confirms things that other people might know, might not know. But I think this is always inspirational, always giving us a way, at least for me, for sure, a way to push forward in what we love, despite the difficulties and everything. So we'll keep in touch for sure. I'll leave you to your day and your work in studio. Thank you very much for doing this. That's all I can say. Thank you very much. That's as simple as
And
that.
happy work, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So again, keep in touch and talk soon on something else because the projects are going to come for sure. Signing off.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Appreciate it.